He will arrive in Beijing with the Iran war still very much at the center of attention. What began as a trip meant to be a high-stakes summit between two of the world's most consequential leaders has arrived with an agenda that refuses to be simple. Trade and technology are on the table, but they sit beneath a heavier weight, an attempt to stabilize a volatile region, a pressure campaign over energy and sanctions, an implicit negotiation over the future of global commerce, and a renewed competition for dominance in artificial intelligence. The American president has framed one piece of the trip in simple personal terms. He said, "I have a very good relationship with the president. I find him to be a tremendous guy, and we get along well." That personal diplomacy, the calculation that rapport can move difficult conversations forward, is deliberate. It is a tool the White House hopes will clear space for negotiations that bureaucracies alone struggle to settle. But that personal history is being tested by a much larger reality, Tehran, and the conflict that now threatens to reshape shipping lanes, oil markets, and the calculus of every capital from Washington to Riyadh to Beijing imposes an immediate and unforgiving timeline on the visit. Days before the summit, Iran's foreign minister traveled to Beijing and met with top Chinese diplomats. Beijing publicly urged Tehran to pursue diplomacy and to refrain from further hostilities. That outreach is significant. China is positioning itself as a potential intermediary in a crisis in which it already has deep commercial ties and growing strategic influence. So the summit begins with the question of leverage. Can China move Tehran? And if it does, will its motives align with American security interests or with a different strategic calculus? Those are not academic concerns. For months, U.S. officials have pressed Beijing to use whatever leverage it has to open the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a large share of the world's oil flows. The ability or willingness of Beijing to influence Iran on that matter underlies much of what will be discussed. Not everyone accepts Beijing's stated neutrality. Some analysts warn bluntly that China should not be treated as an honest broker. Their argument is straightforward. China can help and persuade Iran to come to the table and negotiate, but it is also competing with the United States and often acts in ways that reflect an adversarial posture. That skepticism is a central tension for this trip, a willingness to engage directly with Xi Jinping set against deep suspicion in parts of Washington about Beijing's longer-term intentions. Those tensions are playing out on the ground. Reports indicate that Chinese authorities have instructed some companies to resist certain foreign sanctions when Beijing deems them illegitimate. That posture directly challenges U.S. sanctions policy toward Iran and complicates American leverage. At the same time, the Chinese purchases of oil and the movement of tankers have taken on new geopolitical meaning. A tanker reportedly came under attack near the Strait of Hormuz, the first such incident in the current phase of the conflict. And questions immediately followed about who benefits from instability, who stands to gain by forcing higher prices, and who might profit from recalibrated energy routes and alliances. Trade is the other large and obvious reason for the trip. China needs markets. The United States remains the world's largest consumer base. Beijing's economic model is under strain. Years of attempts to boost domestic consumption have been uneven, leaving exporters in China still looking outward. From Washington's perspective, the summit is a chance to seek a reset on tariffs, to press Beijing on intellectual property practices, and to try to convert China's dependence on American consumers into strategic leverage. In private, administration officials have signaled they intend to use both carrots and sticks, trade incentives and restrictions, to nudge Beijing toward behavior that aligns more closely with U.S. priorities, whether on Iran's supply chains or technology transfers. Those conversations are not happening only at the presidential level. Senators and other congressional delegations have been traveling to and from Beijing as part of a broader, layered approach. The idea is to present a united front. The White House, congressional delegations, and commercial representatives aiming to make clear that trade access and diplomatic goodwill come with expectations. Technology is the third and increasingly defining front. Both nations understand that the future of economic and military power will be heavily influenced by artificial intelligence. American policymakers have publicly discussed the possibility of guardrails to prevent the most dangerous outcomes from the unfettered deployment of frontier AI systems. National Economic Council leaders have described work on an executive-level roadmap that would require more robust safety testing before new powerful models are widely released. As one senior official put it, the idea is to make a model's release to the public akin to an FDA approval, thoroughly tested and proven safe before it is let out into the wild. That analogy, comparing AI rollouts to drug approvals, captures both the emergent anxiety about technological risk and the policy impulse to build precautionary procedures around cutting-edge systems. But that comparison also exposes a strategic dilemma. For guardrails to be globally effective, they must be enforceable and widely adopted. The United States can set standards and hope others follow, but Beijing's willingness to adopt, enforce, or even negotiate on those standards is uncertain. Washington's hope is to lead by example, create a framework that becomes the international norm because U.S. firms and regulators set it, and because aligning with the largest market and the deepest pool of private sector AI expertise is commercially attractive to other countries. This is a delicate balancing act. In the days running up to the summit, officials in Washington made a tactical choice: press China to use its influence in Tehran to reduce tensions in the Gulf, while at the same time loudly asserting American primacy in trade and technology. That dual-track approach carries both promise and peril. If Beijing delivers on nudges to Tehran, it could create space for substantive conversation between the two presidents. If it does not, the optics of the trip will shift sharply and political criticism at home will be quick and severe. Hardliners in Washington warn that the United States should not be seen as ceding leverage or rewarding bad behavior. Moderates argue that direct engagement is precisely the tool needed to test whether personal chemistry between leaders can produce pragmatic outcomes on urgent global challenges. That debate matters because it sets the expectations for what the summit can and cannot accomplish. Energy markets are the near-term test. Oil flows through the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz are highly sensitive to the actions of state and non-state actors. Any interruption drives prices, and volatility feeds into political calculations everywhere. China's role as a major buyer of oil, including purchases linked to Iran, complicates sanctions enforcement. When Beijing signals that its companies will not comply with certain foreign penalties, it forces Washington to decide whether to escalate economic measures or to try to build a multilateral response that constrains Tehran while avoiding a direct clash with China. For U.S. policymakers, that decision is shaped as much by practical realities as by public perception. The administration must show it is protecting American interests, ensuring freedom of navigation, safeguarding global energy supplies, and defending existing sanctions regimes designed to curb proliferate. Ion and state-sponsored violence, those are the commitments that shape public expectations and congressional pressure. At the same time, the president's aides believe that a face-to-face meeting with Xi could open doors on trade, technology, and crisis management that no teleconference or envoy could. That is why the trip was rescheduled and why the timing matters. A short, focused summit can generate momentum, but a misstep can harden positions on both sides. Diplomacy, through personalities, is a fragile instrument. It works best when interests align enough for both sides to claim a win. When core strategic goals diverge, as they do now over Iran, sanctions, and the global rules for AI, personal chemistry can only go so far. On the sanctions front, the practicalities are immediate. Beijing's decision to instruct or tolerate Chinese firms resisting foreign penalties directly challenges the United States' ability to enforce its measures. That posture forces Washington to think about cushions beyond bilateral pressure. Can a multilateral coalition be assembled that limits Iran's access to the global financial system and to critical revenue streams without drawing China into an open economic clash? Or will the United States be forced to use its own economic leverage more aggressively, with potentially significant costs to global markets? Those calculations extend to the behavior of shipping companies, insurers, and bankers. When tankers come under attack, insurers raise premiums, some carriers refuse to transit, and the effective cost of moving oil and goods rises. That cascade constrains choices for energy buyers and exporters alike. It also reshapes diplomatic leverage. Countries that control insurance markets or shipping registries suddenly wield outsized influence. Trade negotiations, meanwhile, are the more prosaic but long-term battleground. Washington wants clear rules for commerce, reciprocal market access, stronger protections for intellectual property, and more predictable behavior by Chinese firms operating globally. China seeks stability and access to markets it can rely on when its domestic demand falters. Each side approaches the summit with bargaining chips: tariffs, market openings, investment measures, and the promise of technological cooperation or restriction. But the wedge issue running through all these discussions is strategic trust. The White House's emerging posture on AI is as much about maintaining a competitive edge as it is about safety. The hope is that by building robust standards, the United States can shape global norms that protect both security and commercial interests. Beijing's response will signal whether a shared regulatory vocabulary is possible or whether the world is headed for a splintered set of rules shaped by competing blocs. There is also a practical choreography to this diplomacy. The summit is not simply a 2-hour conversation between presidents. It is the culmination of days of ministers' meeting. Legislative outreach, corporate delegations, and back-channel diplomacy. U.S. senators and business leaders have already visited Beijing, delivering messages meant to underscore American concerns and to test Beijing's willingness to engage on both economic and security questions. The aim is to present a united front, demonstrate that trade access and diplomatic goodwill come with expectations that go beyond an individual summit. For Beijing, the calculation is similarly complex. China is balancing its commercial needs against strategic imperatives. It wants stable energy supplies, continued access to global markets, and a peaceful periphery that keeps manufacturing and exports moving. It also seeks to limit what it sees as overreach by Washington into technological and economic spheres the Chinese government views as critical to national development. That contest over rules, norms, and leverage is the connective tissue running through every conversation. At the end of the day, the summit's success will be judged against what it produces on two fronts: immediate crisis management, particularly in relation to Iran and the security of the Strait of Hormuz, and the longer-term shaping of trade and technology rules, notably around AI. If Beijing nudges Tehran toward de-escalation, it could create a platform for deeper agreements on trade and technology. If it does not, the visit could harden positions, produce few tangible results, and leave Washington looking for other levers. The stakes are clear and immediate. Energy markets could spike, supply chains could be disrupted, the norms governing a technology that promises to transform economies and militaries could be set by whoever moves fastest and defines the rules first. And the political calculus in Washington is unforgiving. Domestically, leaders who are seen as conceding to rivals while a regional war rages face sharp criticism. Internationally, partners and rivals alike will adjust their strategies based on the signals sent from a high-profile summit. So the president travels to Beijing carrying more than an agenda. He carries a strategy built on personal engagement, backed by a broader U.S. push that mixes diplomacy, sanctions policy, congressional outreach, and an emerging regulatory framework for AI. Xi Jinping, as China's top leader, holds the other half of any outcome. The question is whether personal rapport can bridge the gap between competing strategic goals or whether those gaps will prove too wide. In the coming days, the eyes of capitals and markets will be on the conversations that unfold. Diplomacy is rarely clean, and grand summits rarely produce perfect outcomes. Still, a short, focused meeting that creates momentum on de-escalation, clarifies expectations on trade, and finds narrow common ground on technology safety would be a meaningful result. Failure would be conspicuous, with consequences that ripple from the Strait of Hormuz to the stock market, from shipping lanes to the laboratories and data centers racing to build the next frontier of artificial intelligence. This is not merely a meeting about commerce or chemistry. It is a test of whether two great powers can manage shared risks while